Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to dig into something we all rely on but don't really think about much: transportation logistics. And wow, you sent us a ton of stuff on this: articles, research, the works. Sounds like you're really trying to figure out how this whole system ticks.
Yeah, you could say that. It's more than just getting packages from point A to point B, though. It's like this whole strategic dance that keeps a global economy going, and it's fascinating once you start to understand it.
Okay, so walk me through it a bit. Your notes mention transportation being like the circulatory system of the global economy or something. Why is it that important?
Well, think about it this way. Everything you use, every product, from your phone to the coffee you had this morning, it all had to get to you somehow. And that somehow is usually a complex journey involving ships, planes, trains, trucks. It's the invisible network that connects everyone.
That's a really good point. I never thought of it quite like that. It's easy to forget about all that when you're just, clicking buy now online.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when you consider all the different ways to actually move those goods around because they each have their own pros and cons.
Yeah, you've got trucking, rail, air, sea. So how do companies even begin to choose the best way to ship something? It seems overwhelming.
And it is. Your sources get into the nitty-gritty of all that, which is great. But let's start with something most people are familiar with: trucking. It's kind of the workhorse of domestic logistics, right? You can get pretty much anywhere with the truck, and it offers that door-to-door service a lot of businesses need.
Makes sense. But I imagine it's not always smooth sailing, literally. Traffic, fuel costs, all that must factor in.
Oh, absolutely. Trucking is really best for shorter distances, smaller shipments, and anything that's time sensitive. Think about things like fresh produce or medical supplies. You need those delivered quickly.
So when would a company choose, say, rail instead of trucking then?
Rail is great for moving huge volumes of stuff over long distances, like raw materials, manufactured goods, that kind of thing. It's way more fuel efficient than trucking and can handle a lot more cargo at once.
But I'm guessing it's not the fastest option and probably not as flexible either.
You got it. Rail lines can't go everywhere a truck can, so you often need extra transportation at either end of the journey to get goods to their final destination. Plus, it's just slower by nature. So if speed is your top priority, rail probably isn't the best choice.
So it's always this balancing act between cost, speed, and how much you can actually carry. What about air transport then? That seems like the obvious choice if you need something moved really fast.
It is. When speed is paramount, there's no substitute for air freight. We're talking things like if a hospital needs a specific medical device ASAP, or if you have some high-value electronics that need to get across the world quickly.
But I imagine that kind of speed comes at a price, right?
It does. It's definitely the most expensive option. You've got the fuel costs for those massive cargo planes, specialized handling procedures, airport fees. It adds up quickly.
Okay, so we've talked about trucks, trains, and planes. That leaves us with, well, boats. What about those massive cargo ships you always see? Sea transport just seems like a whole other world.
It really is. Those ships are like floating cities, honestly.
Yeah,
They can carry millions of tons of cargo across entire oceans. It's incredible.
that's mind-boggling. But I imagine it's not the fastest way to ship something. How long does it actually take to get, say, from China to the U.S. by sea?
It's definitely not as quick as flying, that's for sure. We're talking weeks, usually. But that's the trade-off, right? Sea transport is by far the most cost-effective way to move huge volumes of goods, especially things like oil, grain, all those raw materials. You can fit thousands of those shipping containers on a single vessel.
That makes sense. But then you hear about those port backlogs, those supply chain issues that have been in the news lately. It makes you wonder how reliable sea transport really is.
Yeah, that's the downside. It's generally very reliable, but when something disrupts the flow, it can cause huge ripples throughout the system.
Yeah.
Weather, political instability, even something like, well, a global pandemic, it can all lead to delays and higher costs.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? One little snag in one part of the world, and suddenly everyone's feeling the effects.
Exactly. And a lot of companies are trying to mitigate those risks now by diversifying how they transport their goods. They might use a combination of sea, air, rail, depending on what they're shipping and where it needs to go.
So it's about having a backup plan, or even multiple backup plans, which kind of reminds me of that intermodal transportation you mentioned earlier. What was that again?
Right. So intermodal is basically combining different modes of transportation to create the most efficient journey for the goods. So you might have something shipped from, say, Asia to Europe by sea, then transferred to a train to cross the continent, and then finally put on a truck for that last leg to the final destination.
So it's like a relay race, but for shipping containers. Each mode has its strengths, so you use them strategically.
Exactly. And it's becoming more and more popular because it can help businesses save money, reduce their environmental impact. It just makes sense.
Speaking of environmental impact, your notes mention that sustainability is a big factor in transportation decisions these days. It's not just about getting something from point A to point B anymore.
Nope, not at all. Companies are under a lot of pressure to be more environmentally friendly, and transportation is a big part of that.
Yeah. I mean, you think about all those trucks and ships burning fuel, it makes sense. Are there any good alternatives out there yet? Like, are electric trucks a thing?
They're starting to be. Electric trucks are hitting the roads more and more, and there's a lot of research into things like biofuels, hydrogen power, all sorts of interesting stuff. And then with rail, it's already more fuel efficient than trucking, but there are even ways to make it even better. New engine technologies, better route planning, things like that.
So it's not just about making one big change. It's about lots of smaller innovations adding up over time.
Exactly. And that's where strategic planning comes in. Companies need to think about the big picture, how they can optimize their entire transportation network to be more efficient, more sustainable.
It sounds like technology plays a big role in all this. Your research mentioned autonomous vehicles, and I have to admit, I'm a little fascinated by the idea of self-driving trucks. Is that something we're actually going to see in our lifetime?
It's closer than you might think. The technology is advancing incredibly fast. There are already pilot programs testing self-driving trucks in certain areas.
Wow, that's wild. What kind of impact do you think that'll have on the industry as a whole?
It could be huge. Think about it. Autonomous trucks could run 24/7. They wouldn't need sleep breaks like human drivers. Plus, they don't get tired, they don't get distracted, so theoretically, they should be much safer.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about the safety aspect. But what about the drivers? Are robots going to take over all the trucking jobs?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a complex issue. It's likely that some jobs will be lost, yes, but new ones will also be created. People will be needed to develop the technology, maintain it, manage those autonomous fleets. It's hard to say exactly how it'll all play out, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
It's like every technological advancement. There are always trade-offs to consider.
Exactly. And it's important to have those conversations to think about the ethical implications, the societal impact, all of that. But it's not just self-driving trucks we're talking about here. Your research also mentioned drones, specifically for those last-mile deliveries.
Oh, yeah. Drones delivering packages right to your doorstep? That always seems so futuristic to me.
Huh.
Is that really a viable option, though?
It's becoming more and more viable, especially for smaller packages. Drones could be faster, cheaper, and more environmentally friendly than traditional delivery trucks, particularly in cities where traffic is a nightmare.
I can see that. Nobody likes getting stuck behind a delivery truck, that's for sure. But what about the regulations? Wouldn't there be a ton of red tape to get through before we have drones buzzing all over the place?
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of challenges to overcome when it comes to airspace management, safety protocols, privacy concerns, all that. It's going to take time to figure it all out.
So it feels like we're on the verge of a lot of big changes in this industry. It's exciting, but also a little uncertain.
That's a good way to put it. It's a really fascinating time to be following transportation logistics. There are so many factors at play, from new technologies to environmental concerns to just how consumer behavior is changing. It's all connected.
You know, it's amazing how much there is to learn about something as seemingly simple as getting a package delivered. I never would have thought about all the different factors involved, all the moving parts.
It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And transportation logistics is definitely a rabbit hole you can fall deep into. But that's what makes it so interesting.
For sure. And with all the technology on the horizon, it seems like this industry is about to get even more complex, even more high-tech.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've just scratched the surface here. Think about the potential of artificial intelligence to optimize routes, or how data analysis can predict problems before they even happen. There's even talk about using blockchain technology to track shipments and make everything more transparent.
Wow, so we're not just talking about faster trucks and bigger ships. We're talking about completely new ways of thinking about transportation.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not just harder. And that brings us to something else that's really important to consider, the human element.
What do you mean by that? I thought all this technology was supposed to automate everything, make humans less necessary.
Well, yes and no. Sure, some tasks will become automated, that's inevitable, but that just frees up humans to focus on more strategic, higher level thinking.
So, like designing those AI systems you were talking about, or managing those complex global supply chains.
Exactly. We'll need people who can analyze data, make decisions, adapt to changing circumstances. It's not about humans versus robots, it's about humans and robots working together.
That's a good way to put it. It's about using the best of both worlds to create a system that's efficient, sustainable, and adaptable.
Exactly. And for anyone listening who's thinking, wow, this all sounds really interesting, my advice is don't just be an observer, get involved.
I love that.
Yeah.
So for all you logistics ninjas in the making out there, don't be afraid to dive in, explore, ask questions. There's a whole world of transportation logistics out there waiting to be discovered.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with the next big innovation that revolutionizes the way we move things around the planet.
Now that's something to think about. This has been an incredible deep dive, and I know I've learned a ton. Until next time, happy learning, everyone.